The Galactic Council had catalogued every intelligent species it encountered, reducing civilizations to charts, averages, and probabilities. Lifespan. Aggression index. Technological curve. Humanity's entry was short, unremarkable, and quietly dismissive. Short-lived. Emotionally volatile. Cooperative to a fault. A species that talked too much, felt too deeply, and burned through generations like cheap fuel. They were useful, certainly, but only in narrow ways. Trade intermediaries. Infrastructure specialists. The kind of species you let manage systems, not power. Humans had arrived late to the stars, stumbling outward with patched ships and borrowed mathematics. While elder civilizations had mastered energy weapons before humanity discovered electricity, humans were still arguing about borders and belief systems on a single fragile planet. Their early expansion was cautious, almost apologetic. They asked for permission. They signed treaties. They adapted themselves to galactic norms instead of challenging them. To most observers, that settled the matter. What the Council found most reassuring was how predictable humans seemed. They negotiated when threatened. They compromised when pressured. When conflicts arose, they proposed committees, arbitration panels, shared oversight. They spoke endlessly of cooperation, mutual benefit, and long-term stability. Other species mistook this for instinct. They believed humans avoided conflict because they were bad at it. There were dissenting voices, of course. Ancient races that went silent whenever humanity's pre-space history was mentioned. Archivists who quietly locked certain files behind multi-key authorization. But those voices were old, cautious, and easily ignored. The younger empires saw only opportunity. A species eager to belong was a species easy to push. The Threxian Combine was the first to test that assumption openly. They were efficient, hierarchical, and accustomed to obedience. When humans protested the seizure of a minor trade corridor, the Combine laughed. When human representatives cited agreements, the Combine reinterpreted them. When humans requested mediation, the request was delayed, buried under procedure, and ultimately denied. No ships were fired upon. No war was declared. The violation was administrative, bloodless, and absolute. Human shipping slowed. Colonies rerouted. Economic pressure mounted. The Council noted humanity's response with mild interest. As expected, humans complained. They filed appeals. They sent envoys. They argued their case with data, history, and an almost embarrassing belief that fairness still mattered. The Combine interpreted this exactly as everyone else did. Weakness confirmed. What no one noticed was what humans did not do. They did not mobilize fleets. They did not issue ultimatums. They did not threaten retaliation. They absorbed the loss, adjusted their logistics, and continued to participate in council affairs as if nothing fundamental had changed. Their diplomats remained polite. Their trade agreements remained intact. Their public communications emphasized patience. Behind closed channels, older species grew uneasy. Humanity's internal data traffic spiked, but not in ways associated with panic. Research exchanges accelerated. Colonial census updates became unusually precise. Archives long untouched were accessed, copied, and sealed again. None of it violated any law. None of it justified intervention. To the rest of the galaxy, humanity remained what it had always appeared to be, a minor power trying very hard to be liked. A species that valued harmony because it lacked alternatives. A civilization that had never fought a real interstellar war and, by all reasonable projections, never would. The Council concluded its annual review with a simple note. Humanity was stable. Contained. Non-threatening. The Threxian Combine expanded its holdings without resistance, confident it had correctly measured the limits of human response. It was a comfortable conclusion. Logical. Data-driven. And catastrophically wrong. What the galaxy failed to understand was not human technology or numbers, but choice. Every assessment assumed humanity behaved this way because it had no other option. No one asked why a species that survived internal collapse, planetary wars, and near self-inflicted extinction would treat inconvenience as surrender. No one questioned why humans called their restraint policy rather than nature. They would learn that difference far too late. For everyone involved. Humanity did not respond with anger. That was the first mistake. The second was assuming silence meant acceptance. After the corridor seizure, human diplomats returned to the council chambers with revised proposals, not demands. They acknowledged the Combine's authority claims, then dismantled them point by point with precedent, shared interest models, and economic forecasts that showed mutual loss. The tone was measured. The language was careful. It sounded like compromise. The Combine dismissed it. Their representatives interrupted, mocked the projections, and questioned whether a species so new had any right to lecture older powers on interstellar norms. Laughter carried through the chamber. Humanity recorded it and continued. They requested arbitration. It was denied. They asked for provisional protections for civilian shipping. That request expired without response. Still, humanity did not escalate. Instead, they warned. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Human envoys began adding a single sentence to every transmission, identical in wording, calm in delivery. They stated that continued pressure on civilian systems would be interpreted as hostile intent. The sentence was noted, archived, and ignored. The Combine advanced further. Inspection fleets began boarding human vessels under expanded security mandates. Cargo was delayed, seized, or reclassified. Colonists were detained for questioning that lasted weeks. None of it violated council law if one interpreted the clauses creatively enough. Humanity protested every incident, documenting each one with exhausting precision. To outsiders, it looked obsessive. To humans, it was a countdown. The breaking point came without theatrics. A remote logistics station, lightly staffed and clearly marked as non-military, failed to report in. Hours later, sensor data confirmed structural breach and decompression. 43 humans died before rescue craft arrived. The Combine released a statement citing procedural error and regrettable loss of life. No apology followed. No restitution was offered. For the first time, humanity's response was immediate. Their ambassador requested an emergency session. When granted the floor, she did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply listed dates, locations, names, and legal references. Each incident built on the last until the pattern was undeniable. Then she stated that the line had been crossed. The chamber waited for threats. None came. Instead, the ambassador explained what would happen next if pressure continued. Not in emotional terms, but logistical ones. Trade corridors would become unreliable. Security costs would rise. Alliances would fracture under strain. The galaxy would pay for instability that did not need to exist. The Combine representative scoffed. He declared humanity incapable of enforcement, and reminded the Council that humans possessed no fleets comparable to established powers. The remark was entered into the record. Humanity's final communication was brief. The ambassador thanked the Council for its time, acknowledged the Combine's position, and formally withdrew all requests for mediation. Before disconnecting, she delivered a single sentence, her tone unchanged. They were done asking. No declaration followed, yet the shift was unmistakable. Human delegations recalled their negotiators from combined space within hours, citing safety reviews. Data sharing agreements were suspended pending reassessment. Insurance algorithms adjusted risk classifications, quietly multiplying costs for any vessel operating under combined authority. None of these actions were framed as punishment. Each was justified, documented, and legal. Council observers noted something colder than anger settling over humanity's communications. Emotional language vanished. Appeals to shared values stopped. What remained were timelines, thresholds, and conditional statements. Humans were no longer asking others to intervene. They were preparing for outcomes. The Combine mistook this efficiency for retreat. They issued public statements claiming victory and warning humanity against overreaction. Behind the scenes, they accelerated inspections and tightened control, eager to prove dominance. They believed escalation still belonged to them. They were wrong. Humanity had finished arguing. Every restraint had been exercised, every warning issued, every alternative exhausted. What followed would not be framed as revenge or justice. It would be treated as resolution, executed with the same calm professionalism that had been so easy to ignore. The first indication that something was wrong did not come from human space, but from the data markets. Predictive models began failing. Trade forecasts that had accounted for every known variable started producing contradictory outcomes whenever human logistics were involved. Supply routes that should have collapsed held steady. Others that appeared secure began showing inexplicable fragility. Analysts blamed faulty inputs, unaware that the inputs were behaving exactly as designed. Human systems had always seemed inefficient. Redundant routes. Overlapping authorities. Multiple backup protocols where one should have sufficed. Other civilizations streamlined for elegance. Humanity planned for collapse. Their infrastructure assumed sabotage, disaster, and betrayal as default conditions. What looked like disorder was layered contingency. As combined intelligence agencies finally turned their attention inward, they uncovered fragments of a larger pattern. Human research institutions were not siloed but networked through rapid response frameworks. Civilian industries shared protocols with defense sectors under legal structures triggered by specific threat thresholds. None of this violated treaties because the mechanisms had existed for decades, dormant and transparent. Humanity had never hidden them. No one had bothered to look closely. Historical analysis proved more unsettling. Human military archives, long dismissed as obsolete, revealed doctrines centered on adaptability rather than superiority. Humans did not seek decisive battles. They studied failure. They trained commanders to expect misinformation, equipment loss, and communication breakdown. Their simulations rarely included victory conditions. Instead, they modeled survival curves and opponent exhaustion rates. Observers struggled to classify human weapons systems because many were not weapons in the traditional sense. Logistics platforms doubled as denial tools. Navigation software could degrade hostile coordination without firing a shot. Even human manufacturing was optimized for rapid reconfiguration, able to shift from civilian output to strategic production with minimal disruption. They built nothing that could not be repurposed. The most disturbing revelation concerned command philosophy. Human forces were structured to function even when leadership was removed. Authority was distributed, decision-making localized, and objectives framed in terms of intent rather than orders. This made decapitation strategies ineffective. Remove a human commander, and the system did not pause. It adapted. Combined analysts finally accessed restricted cultural files, long buried under psychological classification. Humanity's history was not one of constant war, but of repeated near-extinction events narrowly survived. Environmental collapse. Global conflict. Resource depletion. Each crisis had left scars embedded into policy and engineering alike. Humans did not trust stability. They assumed it was temporary. That assumption shaped everything. Where others pursued deterrence through visible strength, humans favored ambiguity. Where empires displayed fleets as warning, humanity dispersed capability across unremarkable assets. Their greatest investments were not in firepower but in coordination under stress. They prepared not to win wars, but to ensure that anyone who started one would lose more than they could afford. By the time the Combine understood this, the realization spread beyond their borders. Independent observers began recalculating threat indices. Humanity's rating climbed not because of any single weapon or fleet, but because of systemic resilience. They could absorb damage, reroute effort, and continue functioning long after models predicted collapse. Against such a system, overwhelming force was not a solution. It was a liability. The galaxy had mistaken human cooperation for dependency. In truth, it was insulation. Every alliance, every trade agreement, every shared standard was another layer of redundancy. Humans embedded themselves everywhere not to gain control, but to ensure that no single point of failure could isolate them. The final conclusion reached by external analysts was quietly circulated, never presented publicly. Humanity was not dangerous because it sought conflict. It was dangerous because it treated conflict as an engineering problem. Once defined, it would be solved with patience, iteration, and an indifference to pride that other civilizations found deeply unsettling. The question was no longer whether humans could respond. It was whether anyone could stop the response once it began. The response did not begin with an announcement. There was no declaration transmitted across open channels, no ultimatum delivered for effect. Systems under combined control simply started failing in ways no one could immediately explain. Communication relays drifted out of sync by fractions of a second, enough to garble fleet coordination. Navigation beacons reported conflicting positions. Supply manifests no longer matched physical inventories. Nothing exploded. Nothing looked like an attack. Combined command assumed malfunction. Engineers were dispatched. They found nothing broken, only systems behaving exactly as instructed. That was the problem. Human code had not overridden safeguards. It had exploited assumptions, cascading small inefficiencies into paralysis. Fleets remained intact but immobile, waiting for confirmations that never aligned. Within hours, insurance networks suspended coverage for combined flag vessels due to rising risk anomalies. Independent haulers refused contracts. Automated ports denied docking clearance pending verification cycles that could not complete. Commerce slowed to a crawl. Still, no weapons fire. When combined patrols attempted to assert control by force, they discovered their targeting systems degraded under load. Not disabled, simply unreliable. Human platforms never appeared on sensors long enough to engage. Instead, patrols found themselves chasing false contacts, burning fuel, wasting time. Morale eroded as crews realized they were reacting, not acting. The first shots of the war were fired by the Combine, not at humans, but at empty space. Human doctrine did not prioritize engagement. It prioritized removal of options. Power grids feeding combined shipyards began experiencing rolling outages triggered by perfectly legal energy trades executed milliseconds ahead of demand spikes. Manufacturing slowed. Repairs took longer. Replacement parts arrived late, or not at all. Human fleets remained unseen, operating beyond predictable vectors. They did not challenge combined strongholds. They ignored symbols of power entirely. Instead, they isolated them. Data links went dark. Reinforcement requests were delayed by bureaucratic loops humans had helped design years earlier during cooperative reforms. Every system the Combine had optimized for control became a constraint. Council observers watched the situation deteriorate with growing alarm. There were no decisive battles to intervene in, no violations clear enough to condemn. Humanity's actions were precise, deniable, and devastatingly effective. Each step followed existing regulations pushed to their logical extreme. Protests were filed. They disappeared into queues. Within days, combined frontier worlds declared emergency autonomy, unable to receive direction or support. Internal security forces turned inward, struggling to maintain order as supplies dwindled. The Empire's cohesion, once its greatest strength, fractured under pressure applied nowhere and everywhere at once. Only then did human fleets appear, not en masse, but in measured presence. They did not attack. They broadcast navigation corrections, humanitarian corridors, and ceasefire parameters. Any combined unit that powered down weapons and complied was left untouched. Any that resisted found its systems degraded further until resistance became impractical. The war ended without a surrender ceremony. There was no capital seized, no leader paraded. The Combine simply ceased functioning as a unified entity. Its surviving authorities accepted new terms drafted not by conquerors, but by administrators. Borders were redrawn to reflect stability, not pride. Humanity withdrew as methodically as it had acted. Fleets vanished back into deep space. Economic pressures eased. Systems slowly recovered under new management. To the galaxy, it was as if a storm had passed without spectacle, leaving only altered landscapes behind. The lesson was unmistakable. Humanity had not fought to win territory or status. It had fought to remove a threat, efficiently and without excess. The galaxy learned that when humans chose war, it was not an expression of fury. It was a problem being solved, permanently. In the aftermath, the galaxy struggled to describe what had happened. There were no ruins to tour, no decisive battle to analyze, no heroic footage to circulate. Yet an empire that had dominated its region for centuries no longer existed in any recognizable form. The absence of spectacle made the outcome harder to deny. Power had shifted without ceremony. The Galactic Council convened under unusual tension. Delegates spoke cautiously, aware that every word was now being weighed against new assumptions. Policy drafts were revised in real time. Language that once framed humanity as a junior partner was quietly removed. In its place appeared careful phrasing about sovereignty, mutual restraint, and non-interference. No one proposed sanctions. No one questioned legality. The record was clear. Humanity had operated within the system, not against it. Human representatives returned, not triumphant, but precise. They did not demand compensation or territorial concessions. They declined offers of permanent security roles. Instead, they presented a narrow list of guarantees concerning civilian safety, transit integrity, and arbitration enforcement. Each item was framed as preventative, not punitive. Accepting them cost the Council less than rejecting them. Across former Combine space, stabilization took hold under international oversight. Trade resumed along revised routes. Independent worlds negotiated new alignments. Humanity provided logistical support, and then stepped back, refusing leadership positions that would bind them to governance. They had no interest in ruling what they had dismantled. Observers noted the restraint with confusion. Other species would have leveraged such leverage for generations. Humans treated it as temporary authority, something to be relinquished once the immediate danger passed. Their fleets did not linger. Their influence receded to pre-conflict levels, leaving behind only structural changes that made repetition impossible. The cultural impact was slower but deeper. Military academies across the galaxy revised curricula. Theories centered on dominance gave way to studies of resilience and systemic warfare. The phrase, human escalation, entered strategic lexicons, defined not as aggression, but as irreversible commitment once diplomacy failed. To provoke humans was now understood as initiating a process, not an event. Among older civilizations, long silent archives were reopened. Records once sealed as irrelevant were shared, confirming patterns seen before and ignored. Humanity was not unique in its capacity for destruction. It was unique in its willingness to avoid it until no alternatives remained. That choice, repeated across history, has shaped a species that viewed violence as a last resort and final solution. Public narratives within human space were subdued. There were no celebrations, no monuments. Official statements emphasized loss avoided rather than victories achieved. The dead from the logistics station were named, remembered, and marked as the reason the response had been unavoidable. For humans, justification mattered. In time, the galaxy adapted. New treaties included clauses written specifically to prevent miscalculation with humanity. Inspection regimes became transparent by necessity. Economic coercion was recognized as a form of warfare rather than diplomacy. Stability improved, not because fear ruled, but because understanding had. The final assessment recorded by the Council did not list humanity as the strongest species or the most advanced. It labeled them as the most consequential. A civilization that could be ignored until it could not be stopped. A species that asked for fairness, warned of consequences, and acted only when convinced there was no other path. The lesson endured long after memory of the Combine faded. Humans did not seek reverence or dominance. They sought space to exist without threat. The galaxy learned to grant it, not out of kindness, but because once humans stopped asking, the cost of learning why was far too high.